Hi everyone, welcome back to the History in 20 podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Sorry it's been a while, had a lot of other stuff going on, been quite busy, so get on with this one. It's about someone I think we've all heard of. It's Vlad the Impaler, but why did I choose to do one on him, and why now? Well, it's October, so Halloween or spooky season or whatever. And obviously Vlad the Impaler was the inspiration behind Bram Stoker's famous villain, Dracula. So, as usual, we'll go over a bit of a personal profile about him, get straight into it. So, he was born round about 1428 to 31. No one actually knows the exact date of his birth, but it was round about those years. And he was known as either Vlad III, Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad III Dracula. He died somewhere between December 1476 to January 1477. And he reigned on three separate occasions. The first was just a short one from October to November 1448. Then the next one was from 1456 to 1462. And then the last one was from 1476 to 77. His marriages, we don't know much about that. He just has someone who's always referred to as an unknown first wife. And then Justina Silgai. Well, tell you what, before we go any further, I'll apologise for any pronunciations, because obviously it's all from Eastern Europe, Romania, Hungary. I don't know how to pronounce the names over there, so you'll have to bear with me on that one, I'm afraid. Excuse me. And as far as we're aware, he had three children. The eldest was called Minia, who was born in 1462. Then he had an unnamed second son, who was killed in 1486. Then a third son, also called Vlad Dracula. He was part of the Draculesti dynasty and also married into the house of Basarab. So just a quick note before we go any further as well. So throughout this, I'm just going to refer to Vlad the Impaler as either Vlad or Vlad the Impaler, because there are a few other characters called Vlad. So I'll refer to them in full, such as Vlad II Dracula, who was Vlad's father, or Ladislaus II, who was Voivode of Wallachia for a time, just so to avoid any confusion. And if I remember, I'll post a list of the characters in the description box below, so you can, because there's a lot of people in this, and just so you know who's who. So we'll start off as usual with the early life. So with Vlad's early life. So obviously, as I said, Vlad III, who's better known as Vlad Dracula or Vlad the Impaler. He was born in Sighisoara, which is a part of Transylvania, which covers modern-day Romania. You'll be able to see on the map on the screen there whereabouts Transylvania is in relation to modern-day Romania. So, he was born there. He was the second illegitimate son of Vlad II Dracula, hence the name Dracula. Now, his father was the voivode, which is just another word for ruler, of Wallachia, which you'll also see on the map there. He was the Voivode of Wallachia from 1436 to 42, and again from 1443 to 47. Now, the nickname Dracula came from Vlad II's membership in something called the Order of the Dragon, which was a military fraternity founded by Sigismund, the Holy Roman Emperor, in 1408, and it was dedicated to stopping the Ottoman Turks' advance into Europe from the east. So, as I said before, Vlad's date of birth is often contended because there's no definitive sources as to when he was actually born. So the dates are often presumed to be somewhere between 1428 to 31. And we know this because he was old enough to be a candidate to the throne of Wallachia in 1448, meaning his birth would have had to have been at least 20 years before then. So what we do know, though, is that he was born in Sighisoara, where his father lived in a 3-storey stone house, as there's a picture on the screen there. So, as an adolescent boy, during the Varna Crusade, which was from 1443 to 44, Vlad was sent as a hostage to the court of the Ottoman Sultan Murad II, who reigned from 1421 to 44 and 46 to 51. Now, it's here that Vlad was actually exploited as a child sex slave, and the sort of buggery to which he was subjected to can be considered the likely psychiatric source of his later obsessions, which is something we'll obviously go into greater detail pretty shortly. So, as I said before, he reigned 3 times on 3 separate occasions. So, although his first and third rules were significantly shorter than his second, they're still relevant in any discussion about Vlad. So, with no further ado, let's carry on with the first reign, which was, like I said, October to November 1448. So, upon the death of his father and elder brother in 1447, Vlad became a potential claimant to the Wallachian throne, because in Wallachian history it was always assumed that any son of a ruler, of a voivode of Wallachia, did have a claim to the throne. Obviously, even though Vlad was second son, he still had a claim to the throne. However, the current ruler, who was someone called Ladislaus II, had taken the throne before Vlad had a chance to publicly put his claim forward. Now, it's often believed that Vladislav II assassinated Vlad II Dracula, who was Vlad the Impaler's father, in order to seize the throne. Now, Vladislav II was assisted by a man called John Hunyadi, who was a leading military figurehead in Wallachia and part of a noble Transylvanian family. But in September 1448, John Hunyadi launched a campaign against the Ottoman Empire, so Vlad took advantage of Hunyadi's absence and broke into Wallachia in early October. Now, the Ottoman forces defeated Hunyadi's army in the Battle of Kosovo between 17th to 18th of October 1448, but Hunyadi's deputy, a man called Nicholas Vizanki, he urged Vlad to meet him in Transylvania, but Vlad refused. So Vladislav II returned to Wallachia with the remnants of his defeated army, but it was still enough to scare Vlad off. So Vlad then fled to the Ottoman Empire and arrived in a place called Edim on the 7th of December 1448, which put an end to his first reign. Now, his second reign was from the 15th of April 1456 to July 1462. So Vlad moved from Edim to Moldavia, which forms part of modern-day Moldova, Romania and Ukraine today, and that was where his uncle, Bogdan II, had taken the throne with John Hunyadi's support in autumn of 1449. So Vlad allegedly wanted to settle in Brasov, which was a city in Transylvania, but Hunyadi forbade the burghers, who were just the privileged citizens of medieval European towns. They're called burghers, not like cheeseburgers, but burghers, to let him settle there in a letter that he wrote to them on the 6th of February 1452. So Vlad instead returned to Moldavia. Now, unfortunately, and not for the last time, which is quite annoying from a historian's perspective, there's a gap in the history of Vlad's life here. So we do know that he returned to Hungary sometime before the 3rd of July 1456, because on that day Hunyadi informed the citizens of Brasov that he'd tasked Vlad with the defence of the Transylvanian border from the Ottomans. So unfortunately there is a bit of a gap there, 4-year gap, but we move on. So once again, Vlad invaded Wallachia in spring 1456, but rather than garnering support from the Ottomans, he instead tried with Hungarian support. Now, he was successful this time in 2 ways. So firstly, Vladislav II, who was the imposter in Vlad's view, was killed in the invasion. And secondly, Vlad was proclaimed Voivode of Wallachia. Now, this was evident in a letter that was addressed to the burghers of Brasov on the 10th of September 1456. So in this letter, he promised to protect them from an Ottoman invasion of Transylvania, but he also sought their support if the Ottomans occupied Wallachia. Now, perhaps the most important element of this letter, though, I think, is when Vlad stated, "When a man is strong and powerful, he can make peace as he wants to, but when he is weak, a strong one will come and do what he wants to him." Now, this quote is often the first bit of evidence that many historians see as Vlad's completely authoritarian personality coming out into the open. So shortly after this infamous letter is when Vlad began his purges, and now the contemporary Byzantine historian Lanikos Chalconaldes recorded in his chronicle that hundreds of thousands of people were impaled with the aid of needle-thin grease stakes, which was rammed up the victim's rectum and out through the mouth in such a way that these death throes could actually last for days, at Vlad's order at the beginning of his second reign. Now, he initially targeted the aristocrats who'd participated in the murder of his father and brother, or whom he suspected had conspired against him as well. Now, interestingly, Chalconaldes, that's what he's called, Chalconaldes, also wrote that Vlad helped the Wallachian economy somewhat by using the money, property and other goods of his victims to help pay off any debts he'd accumulated from his previous invasions and to pay soldiers in his retinue. Now, the next major event in Vlad's second reign also occurred early on. So John Hunyadi had died on the 11th of August 1456, and his son Ladislaus Hunyadi became the Captain General of Hungary. Now, Ladislaus accused Vlad of having no intention of remaining faithful to the Kingdom of Hungary in a letter to the burghers of Brasov, and ordered them to support a man called Dan III, who was Vladislav II's brother, against Vlad. However, the King of Hungary, Ladislaus V, had Ladislaus Hunyadi executed on the 16th of March 1457. Now, Hunyadi's mother, Erzsébet Szlagyi, and her brother Michael stirred up a rebellion against the king. Now, taking advantage of the civil war in Hungary, Vlad assisted his cousin Stephen, who was the son of Bogdan II of Moldavia, in his move to seize Moldavia in June 1457. Now at this time Vlad also broke into Transylvania and plundered the villages around Brasov and a place called Sibiu. And some early German stories from the early 1460s describe Vlad as carrying men, women and children from a Transylvanian Saxon village to Wallachia and having them impaled. Now, since the Transylvanian Saxons remained loyal to Ladislaus V, Vlad's attack against them strengthened the position of the Sigais. Now, Vlad's representatives participated in the peace negotiation between Michael Sligai and the Saxons, and the burghers of Brasov agreed that they'd expel Dan III from their town. Obviously delighted at this news, Vlad described Michael as his lord and elder brother in a letter that was dated the 1st of December 1457. Excuse me. But obviously nothing ever goes to plan in these sort of things, as I'm sure you've guessed by now. But Ladislaus Hunyadi's younger brother, a guy called Matthias Corvinus, he was elected King of Hungary on the 24th of January 1458 upon Ladislaus V's death. Now, he ordered the burghers of Sibiu to keep the peace with Vlad on the 3rd of March, and in May 1458, Vlad ordered the burghers of Brasov to send craftsmen to Wallachia. He disregarded the Transylvanian Saxons in this respect because he forbade the Saxons to enter Wallachia, forcing them instead to sell the goods to Wallachian merchants at border fairs. And one Saxon merchant confiscated the steel that a Wallachian merchant had brought to him, and upon hearing about this, Vlad ransacked and tortured Saxon merchants in early 1459, according to a letter written by a guy called Basarab Laiota, who was a son of Dan II of Wallachia. And in this letter he said, "The officials and councillors of Brasov cried to us with broken hearts about the things which Dracula, our enemy, did. He captured all the merchants of Brasov who had gone in peace to Wallachia and took all their wealth. But he was not satisfied with only the wealth of these people. He imprisoned them and impaled them, 41 in all. He became even more evil and gathered 300 boys from Brasov that he found in Wallachia. Of these he impaled some and burned others." Now in response, Dan III broke into Wallachia, but Vlad defeated him and had him executed on the 20th of April 1460. And Vlad then invaded southern Transylvania and destroyed the suburbs of Brasov, ordering the impalement of all men and women who'd been captured. And peace was restored, which was simply through the people of Brasov fearing Vlad, by the 26th of July 1460, when Vlad addressed the burghers as his brothers and friends. So, I mean, you can see by now he's obviously an absolute sociopath. But Vlad was obviously not all about brotherly love and friendship, because he had war on his hands. And the war that he had were the ongoing Ottoman wars. So I mentioned earlier he was promoted as a defender on the Hungarian border against the Ottoman Empire, who were constantly at odds with those in Eastern Europe. Now, the most famous of these skirmishes in the Ottoman wars in Vlad's reign was called the Night Attack at Tagoviste, and this battle was fought between Vlad's Wallachian forces and Sultan Mehmed II's Ottoman forces overnight on Thursday the 17th of June 1462. Now, it initially started when Vlad refused to pay the jizya, which is a tax on non-Muslim subjects, to the Sultan, and it intensified when Vlad invaded Bulgaria in early 1462. So in response, Mehmed raised an army of approximately 250,000 men, which was comprised of about 100,000 regular troops and 150,000 conscript engineers, with the aim to conquer Wallachia and annex it to the Ottoman Empire. In response, Vlad raised an army of 30,000 men, 22,000 of whom were light infantry and volunteers, and with a band of these soldiers he attacked the Ottoman camp overnight in an attempt to kill Mehmed himself. Now, the assassination attempt failed, and Mehmed marched to the Wallachian capital of Targoviste, where he discovered it had been almost utterly destroyed. So upon leaving the capital and heading back to Constantinople, Mehmed and his men were absolutely horrified when they discovered what was called a forest of the impaled, which was thousands and thousands of impaled Turks who'd been killed during Vlad's invasion of Bulgaria. Now, the number 23,844 is mentioned by Vlad himself, that's of carcasses impaled, in a letter to Matthias Corvinus in the same year. And our favourite historian, Chococondeals, wrote that there were large stakes on which, it was said, about 20,000 men, women and children had been spitted, quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. There were infants too, affixed to their mothers on the stakes, and birds had made nests in their entrails. Now, it wasn't hard to see why, even with an army that was 8 times larger than Vlad's, that Mehmed retreated back to Constantinople. So our next little section is on Vlad's imprisonment, which was from 1462 to 75. So shortly after receiving Vlad's letter describing the gory details of the thousands of impaled Turks, Matthias Corvinus, or he was now titled Matthias I of Hungary, he came to Transylvania in November 1462 upon Vlad's request. Now, Vlad was insistent on waging war against the Ottoman Empire, but Matthias was hesitant despite the negotiations lasting for weeks. So in the end, Matthias contacted a Czech mercenary who was called John Jiskra of Brandis, and he captured Vlad near Ruka in Wallachia in order to imprison him. Now, Vlad was imprisoned in Hungary at Matthias's request, but in order to explain Vlad's sudden imprisonment to Pope Pius II, Matthias presented 3 letters to him, allegedly written by Vlad on the 7th of November 1462. One of them was allegedly written to Mehmed II, one was written to Mahmud Pasha, who was Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, and another to Stephen III of Moldavia, who was Vlad's cousin, who he assisted earlier, if you remember me mentioning him. Now, in these letters, it was stated that Vlad had offered to join his forces with the Sultan's army against Hungary if the Sultan restored him to his throne. So many historians agree that these letters were forged to give grounds for Vlad's imprisonment, but Pope Pius II obviously bought the story of Vlad's 3 letters, and he made sure he stayed imprisoned. Now, he was first imprisoned in what's referred to as the city of Belgrade, which strangely wasn't the modern-day capital of Serbia, but what's now a place called Alba Iulia in Romania. And he was then taken to Visegrad in Hungary, where he was held for 13 years. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there was another gap in Vlad's biography, and that's here. So there's absolutely no documents that we know of yet have actually been preserved which refer to Vlad between 1462 and 75. But what we do know is that in summer 1475, Stephen III of Moldavia sent his envoys to Matthias Corvinus, asking him to send Vlad to Wallachia against Basarab Laiota, who'd submitted himself to the Ottomans. Now, Stephen wanted to secure Wallachia for a ruler who'd been an enemy of the Ottoman Empire, because the Wallachians were like the Turks to the Moldavians, according to his letter. Now, Matthias accepted Stephen's request and he released Vlad from prison. So my last little section is Vlad's third rule and death, which is 1475 to 77. Now, Matthias recognised Vlad as the lawful prince of Wallachia, but he didn't provide him military assistance to regain his principality. So Vlad moved from Hungary to Transylvania in June 1475, before briefly returned to Pécs in Hungary to purchase a house, and his house became known as Dracula Haza, which means Dracula's house. Now, Mehmed II invaded Moldavia, and he defeated Stephen III of Moldavia in the Battle of Velia Alba on the 26th of July 1476. But meanwhile, Vlad stayed in Brasov, and he confirmed the commercial privileges of the local burghers in Wallachia on the 7th of October 1476. So Stephen and Vlad ceremoniously confirmed their alliance, and together they occupied Budapest, forcing Basarab Laiota to seek refuge in the Ottoman Empire on the 16th of November. So Vlad informed the merchants of Brasov about his victory in a speech and urged them to come with him to Wallachia, and he was crowned Voivode of Wallachia on the 25th of November 1476. However, Basarab Laiota returned to Wallachia with Ottoman support and completely overwhelmed the Wallachian forces, taking them by surprise. Now, Vlad was killed in the fighting then sometime in either late December 1476 or early January 1477, and he was aged between 45 to 49. So in a letter written on the 10th of January 1477, Stephen III of Moldavia related that Vlad's Moldavian retinue had been massacred, and according to Leonardo Botta, who was the Milanese ambassador to Buda, the Ottomans cut Vlad's corpse into pieces, and his head had been sent to Mehmed II. And the actual site of Vlad's burial is unknown, which further adds to elements of mystery of his life. But according to popular tradition in the 19th century, pieces of Vlad's body were reportedly buried in the monastery of Snagov, which is in modern-day Romania. However, when it was actually excavated in 1933, nothing was found, which only adds to the horror stories and myths which surround the real-life Dracula. So that's Vlad's life, so we'll have a little bit about his legacy now. So there's plenty of works containing stories about Vlad's cruelty, and these actually emerged as early as the 1480s in the Holy Roman Empire. And obviously the invention of movable print in the 1450s, thanks to a man called Johannes Gutenberg, meant that these stories and woodcuts could be published en masse and distributed across Europe. And these initial stories about Vlad and his reputation actually became one of the earliest examples of a best-selling book. And obviously to enhance sales, many of the books were published with woodcuts on their title pages which depicted these horrific scenes. And notable examples of these include the editions published in Nuremberg in 1499 and Strasbourg in 1500, as you'll be able to see on the screen now. But where did the Dracula connection come from? So we know that he was called Vlad Dracul, but what about the vampiric element? So interestingly, Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula is actually the first time a connection was made between Vlad and vampirism. But it's not just the blood-sucking element which makes it that vastly different to Vlad's life. There's numerous other similarities that can be drawn. So, for instance, the fact that Stoker's Count Dracula lives in a Transylvanian castle, as did Vlad, and the stakes which can be used to kill vampires, such as Vlad impaling his enemies on stakes, and rumours of his body being buried in a church, which was popular in the 19th century regarding Vlad, and obviously nothing being found there, another element that's similar to Dracula in the book. And one of my favourite historians, Norman Davies, he contends that stories about Vlad's cruelties serve to remind us about religious fanaticism and inherent evil which persisted in Western Europe as well as Eastern Europe. Now, to explain this, he draws upon examples of Mary I of England, who you might know as Bloody Mary, and her persecution of Protestants. I think off the top of my head she burned about 280 in her reign, as related in John Fox's Book of Martyrs in 1563. And he says they belong to the same sickening genre as the horrors of the Wallachian vampire prince. So I hope you enjoyed this one. Make sure you've obviously got plenty of garlic in your house to keep away those vampires. So I hope everyone who's celebrating has a great Halloween, and I hope you've enjoyed this one. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, invite all your friends, see if they're into it. It'd be great if we can try and reach 100 subscribers by the end of the year. That's my target, so if we could all help with that, that'd be fantastic. I've got all my links to my socials below, so if you want to check those out as well, feel free. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.